So our next presenter has kindly joined us all the way from the United Kingdom. Dr. Nigel Hoggard is a professor of neuroradiology at the University of Sheffield. He's been working over the last couple of decades as part of the multidisciplinary research group, Sheffield Institute of Gluten-related Disorders, which has published numerous articles on gluten-related neurological disease. They recently published a paper demonstrating cognitive and structural brain changes in patients with celiac disease from the UK Biobank study in gastroenterology. Dr. Hoggard is an expert in brain health and sensitivity to gluten. Dr. Hoggard, thanks so much for taking time out of your evening to join us. Over to you.
This is what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about brain health and gluten sensitivity. Could we have the next slide, please? So these are my financial disclosures. I've got another big whopping disclosure to share with you, and that is some years ago I volunteered for one of my and Maris's studies, and it turns out that I have antibodies to gluten, and then being a simple soul, it hadn't occurred to me that my headaches that I had, my migraine, which was happening several times per week and was quite disabling, might be related to that. So, but Marius did twig, and he put me on a gluten-free diet, and now I don't get any headaches. So I am on a gluten-free diet and have been for some years. So I'm in the same boat as some of you. And I think we'll just explore what this boat of neurological symptoms with gluten means for people. So you should have the next slide, please. So this is where it all started back in the 1990s. This is Maris's first paper on the topic, and you'll notice on the first line of that summary in the background is anti-gliadin antibodies. Now they're a test which was used widely in the 1990s, but have fallen out of favour because it's found in the general population, and our work has demonstrated that it's found in about 10% of the population in the UK, and that goes up a little bit as people age. So when we test people in their 60s and 70s, the rate is nearer 13-14%. So it's prevalent, and people didn't know what to make of it, so they moved on to more specific tests in celiac disease, such as TG2, which is the transglutaminase 2, which is the main test, which is come into use since then. Next slide. So this is my bread and butter. I'm a neuroradiologist. I do brain imaging day in, day out, and I have to report the scans. And these are the sort of scans I have to report. And the thing that I had the headache, and sometimes you would get a bit of brain fog. And what do I mean by that? I mean just slightly hazy. You know, you're not on it. That was how it was for me. I know some people get more serious symptoms from it, but that was how it was for me. And as well as those cognitive issues that you can sometimes get in this condition, there's also another group who have something called gluten ataxia, which you heard mentioned in by the last speaker. And the cerebellum, which is the thing which is being ringed there, is withered and somewhat shrunken in this individual. And the cerebellum is like the balance center of the brain. It's involved in taking all the data from the sensors, particularly sensations in terms of pressure and in your muscles and your legs and your joints, and combining that with the messages coming down from the top part of the brain, the cerebral cortex, asking your body to do things, and it matches them up and takes feedback and puts it into the system, and it's kind of like constantly updating and modeling what you have to do. So you can imagine if that doesn't work properly, then coordination becomes a problem. And we also get problems with movement and balance and those sort of things. And also there's another group who have a problem with sensation, which we'll come on to later. Next slide, please. So my interest in brain health in this condition was kind of sparked by this sort of patient. So this is a lady in her mid-60s, so not that much older than me. And if you look, what happened to this, the white stuff, which is arrowed on the right-hand image, that's abnormal white matter. And what is white matter in the brain? Well, white matter is the wiring, it's the connection. So the grey matter, as we call it, is the cortex on the surface of the brain and in deep structures right at the center of the brain. And that's like the computer bit of the brain. And then all the connections that allow them all to coordinate with each other, that's the white matter. And this is what's damaged in this process of so-called white matter disease or small vessel disease, call it what you like. But it's damaging those connections. And so it tends to slow down thought processes and makes them slightly less coherent, and therefore there are problems in a number of things, like, for example, executive function, where you know, decision making, when you're weighing up complex things, that sort of thing. Next slide, please. So this is what we were seeing when we went to show this at conferences back in the day. People didn't, you know, got talked down really, and people were doubters. So how do you turn doubters into believers? Well, you have to show them that it's not just our data that shows this, it's other people's data that shows this. So next slide, please. And this is what made me want to do the Biobank study. And this is, the Biobank is an amazing health research resource in the UK. One of the few things we seem to get right these days. And they collected data from 500,000 people, and they're in the process of imaging 100,000 of those people. And there's some funding coming through to try to continue this into the future. So we look to find people with typical celiac disease in this group. Sorry, next slide. And so what we did, we found 100 people with celiac disease from this, amongst this 500,000 people, but they had to be otherwise healthy. They had to be not taking any psychoactive medication, because we wanted to look at some of the testing that these people get as part of this big study. And they also had to have brain imaging available at the time when we were doing the study. And then we also got some controls, so people who were matched in age and sex and body weight and highest level of education, and another thing that can damage white matter disease, because that was what we were focused on in this study. We were interested in hypertension, so high blood pressure. That's another major risk factor for damaging the white matter in the brain. Next slide, please. So there's a whole battery of cognitive tests that these people go through as part of this study. And there's also some multiple choice questions they get asked about the symptoms and aspects of mental health. And they also undertake advanced brain imaging. This is something called diffusion tensor imaging that you're seeing on that image below. And that's a way of looking at the diffusion in the brain that enables you to work out whether that wiring, that white matter, whether those fibers are actually intact or whether they've been damaged and are disconnected, as it were. Next slide, please. So we had 100 patients with celiac disease and 200 matched controls. And this is what we found. So look, you can imagine if you disrupt the connections between different parts of the brain, the reaction time, which involves seeing something, part of your brain working out what it is you're seeing, then another part of the brain thinking, okay, I've got to do something about that. And then you're going to do a reaction, you're going to actually make a movement. All that takes what the white matter to wire up those different parts of the brain. And so you can imagine that reaction time is slowed. And this is a very significant result. So it's not disastrously bad, it's just a little bit slower in people with celiac disease compared to controls. So this is a real hard finding. This is a very robust test. Other things that we found when we looked at the patients with celiac disease was that they tended to show more symptoms of feeling worried or anxious. You can see that it's not quite double, you know, it's 31.5% with those sort of symptoms versus 18 in those control patients. If you look at the people in terms of mood, again, there's significantly more low mood and depression in the patients with celiac disease compared to those who did not have it. And then even more serious things like, have you ever contemplated self-harm? Again, that is significantly much more common, or double, in fact, more than double, the rate in the people with celiac disease versus those without. So you can see that there's just a general unhappiness with their own health in people with celiac disease generally as well. Next slide, please. And this is what we found on the brain imaging. So this is advanced. This is the diffusion tensor imaging (DTI). You may have heard it mentioned on the news in context of different studies being published. And this demonstrates you can see the different color scale. The areas which are red and orange are not as they should be, and are significantly different from what one would ideally want. So we've delayed reaction time. We've found those changes in mood, and we've also found these changes on the hard physical kind of imaging side of this patient's imaging. Okay, so this is our first step in trying to turn doubters into believers. Next slide, please. And that was all published in a very nice paper published in Gastroenterology a few years ago. Next slide, please. So, how come I don't see it in my patients? Well, okay, so I guess that's really a reflection of how frequent are these things, and how hard are you looking, I guess, would be the other thing. And this study was supported by these two charities, Brett and Celiac UK. Next slide, please. So what we did was we took 100 consecutive patients being diagnosed with celiac disease for the first time from our colleague here in Sheffield, David Sanders. And instead of them going to just see the gastroenterologist, they went to see Marius, who's a neurologist, and they had a thorough examination for the neurology system. They had testing for something called TG6. Now, you've heard me mention TG2. Now, TG6 is something that we've been working on for quite a long time now with our colleagues in the University of Cardiff under Daniel Eshelman. And what we've demonstrated is that the patients who have the ataxia, the bit which the cerebellum becomes that more shriveled shape, that is associated. I'm not saying it's directly linked. I'm not saying that the TG6 antibodies cause it necessarily. It might do, but we don't know. Those two things are linked. So we were interested to see if these people had this antibody. So just a little story about. So I mentioned that in the diagnosis of celiac disease, TG2, this is a transglutaminase 2. These are enzymes that are very widely distributed in the vasculature and in the body, TG2, and that's the one that you get antibodies to, and that's celiac disease. If it's to the whole family of these enzymes, these transglutaminases, and if you have antibodies to the TG3, then you get dermatitis herpetiformis, which is known to be linked to celiac disease. But you tend to be about a decade older. And it's the same thing with ataxia. So the ataxia patients tend to have antibodies to TG6. And they also tend to present at an older age than people with celiac disease. And that's kind of good news. If you present with celiac disease, the chances are you'll get onto a gluten-free diet pretty much straight away. And it's the symptoms you get from celiac disease tend to be quite motivational, whereas the vaguer symptoms from some neurological conditions sometimes for some people make it harder to stick to a gluten-free diet. So we did the neurological examination, we checked the blood serum for TG6, and we did MRI scanning in quite a lot of detail with structural T1 wave imaging. Next slide. So this is the constellation of what we found when we talked to this group of 100 patients. So in terms of what they reported themselves, we saw that headaches are very frequent. We saw that balance problems are pretty frequent, and also sensory symptoms are quite common as well. And then on examination, 10% had signs of peripheral neuropathy. That's where, if you say the doctor sticks a sharp, object, like a neurological pin or something like that into your leg, it doesn't feel quite as sharp as it should do, or you may not feel it at all if it's severe. Nearly a third of people are saying, 29% are saying they've got difficulty walking, and over 10% have nystagmus. Nystagmus is a flickering of the eyes where it's related to the cerebellum, and it's about control of eye movements, and that's, you know, that's a hard finding. That's not something, you know, headaches, I accept that headaches are common, but so what, you may say, but well, these other things are there. And if you exclude headaches, you've still got 50% of this group of people, 50 out of the 100, with some features of neurological problems. So it's common. You know, these are people who've not had celiac disease for a long time. These are newly diagnosed. Next slide. And this is a couple of graphs, and what we're trying to demonstrate is that we had about 40% of these people with newly diagnosed celiac disease had already got the TG6 antibodies. And if you look at the two graphs, they're looking at the grey matter volume. So these were the bits of computing power that I suggested earlier, and the graph on the right is about the cerebellum. That's the shrunken tree-like looking thing that we saw on that initial scan, and that's clearly smaller in people who've got these antibodies, and also actually a structure called the thalamus, which is like a relay center. So it sits like a couple of eggs in the very base of the brain, and it's a relay point for all the information coming down from the cerebral cortex, the grey matter on the surface of the brain, and all the information coming up from the brainstem, from the spinal cord, from your peripheral nerves, from the cerebellum, all that information going up. There's a relay center, and that's the thalamus. And the thalamus is linked, and the cerebellum is linked into the thalamus. And the part of the thalamus that was smaller in these people was actually the bit that's linked to the cerebellum. Next slide. So now we've found that you know, it's quite common, and we've described that it happens, you know, in everybody's patients if you look for it. So, okay, so what's the next thing? If it's related to celiac disease, does the gluten-free diet help? Does it go away if you stick to a gluten-free diet? Okay, next slide. So we managed to persuade 30 of these 100, the original 100, to come back. And we went through the same rigmarole as they went through the first time. So we did a thorough examination of the neurological system. We tested their blood for the antibodies, and we also did structural brain MR imaging. Next slide, please. So the arrows that are coloured green are where it's got better over the 7 years. The arrows black, it hasn't changed, and the red arrows are where it's got worse. So let's have a look. So, like me, and you know, quite a lot of the people who were getting headaches that were frequent at the beginning, at baseline, 7 years later had improved, and 20, you know, so down to 20% getting frequent headaches. The balance problems, however, had got worse. And so gait ataxia, what that means is your walking ability. Walking is actually quite a demanding thing to do, which is why it takes us a while to learn how to do it as little children. And it takes quite a lot of coordination, and that had got worse. So that's another sign of the cerebellum. And then the final thing is that we got some people developing that peripheral neuropathy, that loss of sensation in the feet on examination. So what I just wanted to point out is at the beginning is something that's very important. So half of our group of patients have managed to achieve negativity of all gluten-related antibodies. So that's TG2, TG6, CMA, antigliadins, the whole lot were negative. And that's actually quite hard to do. It's more demanding than perhaps people realize. That you've really got to stick to it, and you've got to be thinking about it every meal and all the time, and not make mistakes and all the rest of it. So it's quite demanding, it's quite hard. But if you can do it, then the problems tend to go away. Okay, next slide, please. So for those, if you look at coming on to what we're saying, so we're sort of saying, okay, so the brain tends to shrink if you have these antibodies, this TG6, and how much does it matter? You know, is it a problem? Is it not a problem? Well, here we're seeing the rate of atrophy, which the shrinkage rate, as it were, you're losing 0.73% per year, okay, per year, and that you only have to add up what that is over a decade to realize that actually ends up being quite a lot if you stay positive. If you can get it so that you are negative, you end up being in a very similar position to just ordinary general public. You know, the brain gets smaller as we get old anyway, okay? And that's the kind of level that they're at with when it reduces by 0.32% per year. And those are the areas that are affected. You can see the yellow is the cerebellum, and the green does highlight the cerebellum, but also shows it actually extends it up into part of the thalamus as well, as we've described already. Okay, next slide, please. So, moving on, the timing of this meeting is for us, it's just a few weeks too early, I'm afraid, because we're engaged in this study which has been funded by Beyond Celiac, and we're looking at we've got a cohort of a lot of patients with neurological problems related to gluten, over 1,000 that Maris is looking after in his clinic, and we're doing these tests. So we're looking at the quality of life, we're looking at anxiety and depression, and we're looking at brain health by looking at the rate of atrophy, the shrinkage, and we're looking at white matter disease. Now we aren't through this. We're partway through this study, and hopefully we'll be publishing our findings in the first quarter of next year. But we aren't quite ready yet to share all the results. But I'll next slide. I'll show you what we've got. So we're testing people as they come to clinic, so we don't want to really put people around, and we've only got limited resources anyway. So what we're doing is something called the HADS, anxiety depression scores, and this is incredibly widely used. It's been in use for decades, and it measures the rate of anxiety, and it measures a rate of depression. And there's lots of information. It's very robust, and everyone's been using it for a long time. Everyone knows what it means. And then there's a newer test on the block. Now, the cognitive affective syndrome scale is something that's been developed in Boston by Dr. Sharman there, and it's a bespoke test of the problems caused by cerebellar disease on the way that we think, because cerebellum not only does jobs involving catching a ball or walking or running or those sort of advanced sort of mechanical motor type things, but also it does a very analogous job for other bits of the body. So in speech, for example, our brains live in the world slightly, you have to predict what somebody's going to tell you at the end of a sentence so you can answer immediately, and the cerebellum helps you model that, and it does the same thing for emotions, and so it's got a range of different things that are affected in the cognitive function when the cerebellum is injured. And so that includes emotional regulation, it includes language, it includes executive function, making decisions, that kind of thing. So that's what we have been using, and there's been some really nice work from Boston validating that across all aspects of ataxia, not just gluten-related ataxia. And then there's something called the SF12, which is, again, the physical part of something called the SF36, and that's one of the most commonly used quality of life measurements that anyone uses around the world. It's incredibly commonly used. Everyone understands it. It's a very robust test. So next slide, please. So this is what we've got. So we've got serology. So, this is the antibody measurements in blood. Okay, that's what serology means. And we've got that for, so far, we've collected it from 1,010 patients in the study. There's more to come. We aren't stopping. We've got more, we've got potentially another 500 patients to recruit. We're doing cognitive testing, as I say, a couple of patients per week. It's not massively rapid, but that's what we can do. And the mean age of those people is just under 60 years. And we're also sending out questionnaires to everyone coming to clinic, and the age for the people returning them is slightly older. And we've got a slight female preponderance there. 64% of people in the study are female. Okay, so next slide then, please. So what are we finding so far? Well, look, the prevalence of anxiety is over 30%. If you look at the population levels, it's 12.5 to 19% in the literature. So it's significantly, and it's quite interesting, isn't it? I mean, we can maybe talk about it at the end, why anxiety might be more prevalent. You've also got a significantly higher prevalence of depression. Well, that's a slightly harder one, isn't it? Because if you've got an illness, chronic illness, then I guess you are more likely to be unlikely to have low mood and depression. But there are also things linking depression and anxiety to inflammation, which we can talk about later. And then the SF-12, which is our quality of life measure, 2 standard deviations is well abnormal. It's just, it's a very significant finding, and you can see that this is an illness that has to be taken seriously, and we're trying to make people listen. Yeah, we need people to listen because it matters. It's important to these people that are affected. Okay, next slide. So this is what we found on the cognitive score. So these are how you kind of classify whether you've passed or failed this test, to look to see if your cerebellum isn't functioning in the way that it ought to allow those various parts of your brain to function normally in terms of making decisions, weighing up the alternatives in executive function, or language, or other things such as deciding which language and mood. Next slide, please. So this is kind of a bit more detail on that. So look, you can see the areas. So this is called a radar map, and the further away from the edge of the spider's web it is, the worse it's affected. Okay, so you can see here that affect, so your mood is badly affected. Semantic fluency and phonemic fluency are measures of language function. So semantic fluency would be, say, name as many objects in a certain length of time, to do with transport, say, within a category. Whereas phonemic is like, all the words you can think of beginning with F or something, I don't know. So those language skills are clearly affected. We can see that the digit span, which is a measure of working memory, the day to, the minute to minute, hour to hour kind of memory you need just to function in life, that's also affected. But not so much, memory as in verbal recall. So distant memory, not really affected, and your attention isn't really affected, and your abstract reasoning, you're kind of like intelligence, as it might be, I looked at, isn't affected. And if we just look at those, it's quite striking, isn't it, really, the range of things that are being affected. What I would say is there's no difference, actually. I just should have pointed out, actually, that we've got amongst that 1,010 people, we've got quite a similar spread between those that had a diagnosis of celiac disease and a similar number who haven't had a formal diagnosis of celiac disease, but they still have all the antibodies to gluten, and they have what we call gluten sensitivity. So there's not really any difference on this testing between the two groups. Okay, yeah, next slide, please. Okay, right, coming towards the end. So look, the brain imaging is we've only really just started the brain imaging analysis. And what we've tried to concentrate on to get some results out for you here is take people who we've got scans for 5 years, at least 5 years apart. We're taking the first scan and the last scan to see how they've gone over that period, okay? And we've got 50 of them have got a record of positive serological tests. When we test for the antibodies, they're still positive, and some that don't. And it's about half and half, okay? And we're going to, the initial analyses are concentrating on this, and we're just looking at the whole brain volume, okay? Next slide, please. So, you know, regardless of starting point, we'll be doing comparisons first and last, and we're looking at the number of years over the interval between the two to get yearly rates of atrophy. That's how we're going to report all this, okay? And then we're comparing that with the serology, those antibody tests, okay? Next slide, please. So this is what the average person, the mean, the average kind of person in that cohort looks like, okay? And this person is 72, and they, you can see that they don't have a dramatic difference between the two scans. This person, in this particular example, doesn't have celiac disease, but has gluten sensitivity. Next slide. Now, there's 7 years between these two scans, so the overall volume loss is 3.5%, just over 3.5%, and there is some difference. You can see the image on the left in the center of the slide is the first one, and then the one 7 years later, and you can see that there's slightly more dark bits, which are the sulci between the bits of brain, which are the gray stuff on the scan. Sorry, I can't share a pointer with you, I'm afraid. Yeah. Okay, next slide. Okay, and it's not doing what it should do. There's a little animation there which didn't seem to be running.
Yeah, I don't think it is. Sorry.
No worries, no worries. Fine, okay. Next slide. Right, so this is a 71-year-old who also doesn't have celiac disease, but has gluten sensitivity. And these are 6 years apart. Now, I hope you can see there's actually a very significant difference between the two scans. The two dark things, the paired things that look like a mirror image of each other, right in the center there, the lateral ventricles, and they're significantly larger on the second scan. And there's lateral ventricles are where the CSF, the fluid that bathes the brain, is in the center of the brain, and that implies that the stuff surrounding it, which is white matter, is shrunken, okay? But it's not just the white matter that's shrunken. Actually, if you look at the gaps between the little pokey out bits, they're the sulci, which also contain CSF. They're much wider, and the gyri, as we call them, the actual solid bits of brain, they're narrower, they're thinner, because this person's lost quite a lot of brain tissue. If you just go into the next slide, we'll see if the animation works or not. Okay, so we've got cerebellum. You can just see.
Sorry.
That's fine. So this, look, 15.6% in 7 years. That's a huge. Ooh,
There you go.
it's not going to work. Don't worry. So a yearly rate of 2.6%. That's a lot of brain to be losing. Okay, that's a lot of brain to be using. So this person would really benefit from trying to nail that gluten-free diet and trying to nail getting those antibodies down to 0. Okay, next slide. Yeah, no, it's not going to. Oh, that's a shame, isn't it? Anyway, never mind. Look at animation,
Okay.
but
We'll pretend there's fancy lights going.
Yeah, we'll pretend that everything's getting much worse, and we'll move on to the next slide. I'm drawing to a close, so don't worry, not too much longer to go. Okay, so we can see that the atrophy gets worse as you get older, and that's well known and well recognized. But we've done some work to look at that already. And we can see that actually there's not much difference between whether you have celiac disease or whether you don't have celiac disease. And remember, these patients were all recruited from a clinic of people with neurological illness. Okay, that's why they're in the clinic. Okay, so it's not all people with celiac disease. This is people who've got neurological problems. Okay, talk about next slide. Okay, right, fine. I'll try and rush through this quickly as we can. What we are saying is that the length of time and the amount of antibody you have, the TG6, matters, okay? And if we go to the next slide, we'll just show you how that it survives correction for age and everything like this. So it's a robust finding. And if you just go to the next slide. So in the people who don't have celiac disease, there's a linear line basically demonstrating that these antibodies are associated with the higher the level, the longer you've had them for, is associated with worse brain volume. Okay. Now, in people with CD, with celiac disease, that doesn't happen. So there must be something else going on in that group, and we haven't explored that yet. That's to come. Okay, next slide. So the final bit of work we're doing is on gluten-free diet adherence. And it's quite interesting, isn't it? Look, so 98%, everyone's trying really hard, okay? Everyone's doing their best, okay? It's quite interesting though, isn't it? When we designed a quiz with one of our expert dietitians who's been doing this work for a long time, is very, very good. And Nick designed a little quiz to get people to see how good their knowledge was. And look, 60% people failed the quiz, okay? And this is all stuff that he teaches every time he sees a patient, okay? So mainly it was people being overzealous, okay? People avoiding some foods which didn't actually contain any gluten. However, 10% didn't recognize really obviously gluten-containing foods, okay? And this kind of speaks to a need for ongoing support, doesn't it? You know, we really do need help with sticking to a gluten-free diet. It's not easy, and clearly people kind of sometimes get into bad habits or forget or whatever it is, but they need support. Next slide. This is, you've probably seen this slide lots of times in different guises. It's used a lot in medicine and in celiac disease in particular. And what I want to point out is, at the moment, we recognize some of the top level, the classical celiac disease, we recognize some of that, neurological brain injury. We recognize some of the stuff, brain health impairment from people with celiac disease who present with neurological problems, as I was talking about in this clinic of 1,010 people. And then we've also got these people with gluten sensitivity, but without celiac disease, but do have some gastrointestinal symptoms. And then we've got this big group who have gluten sensitivity without any signs of any bowel problem at all. And they're probably the biggest group. You know, in terms of numbers, there's a lot of people out there with these antibodies, but we don't know. We don't know. We haven't. We need more. We need to do more work. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to. I'm going to finish on this. Really. So I want you to go away with these 3 points. I want you to realise that actually neurological symptoms are really common in celiac disease. They're really common in gluten sensitivity, and there's a wide range of manifestations. It could be headache, it could be foggy brain, it could be sensory problems, it could be coordination and balance or walking problems, or eye problems or language problems. If you bother to look hard enough, you will see on objective testing changes on cognition and brain imaging related to patients with celiac disease and gluten sensitivity. And then the final thing I want to stress is that we've got emerging and ever stronger evidence that if you can really stick to a strict gluten-free diet and you can really eliminate those antibodies, and that brings us onto a topic which I'm no expert. I'm I'm a patient here rather than an expert. You know, this idea of microdosing, where we all get exposed to tiny little levels of, who knows where that, how that plays into getting down to a zero level of antibodies. But it's certainly true that if you can eliminate the antibodies, you seem to arrest the process. So I just need to say some thank yous. Next slide, please. So a lot of this work has been done by my postdoc, Ian Kroll, and I've worked for many years with Marios and Dave Sanders, and Paul Armitage is one of the brains of the outfit, doing a lot of the clever stuff behind the scenes on the image analysis side. And there's a whole range of people who contribute to this work over the years, and I've just mentioned some of the highlight people there. And there are our funders at the bottom there. Welcome, and Brett and Sabi Foundation, and Celiac UK and Beyond Celiac more recently. So thank you very much.
We have a lot of questions for you. I'm going to try to group as best I can. Lots of folks were wondering about, so the brain scans that you presented of celiac patients, were they on a stable gluten-free diet? And when you referred to patients with celiac disease, does that mean those who are on the diet?
So, okay, so there's on the diet and there's on the diet, isn't there? Yeah, everyone's trying, but with varying degrees of success. And so the people who tend to progress are the ones that aren't managing to eliminate those antibodies. And the problem with the antibodies is that you probably don't have access to them in pretty much all the centers, actually. So the ones that we use for monitoring, you know, strictness of diet adherence are antigliadins, and they've gone out of fashion, so they're not widely available. Most hospitals will not have access to them. And then the TG6 antibody testing, which we also do, is also not widely available yet. It's only just being rolled out, really. There is a commercial kit out there, so it is possible to get hold of it. But it's not widely available yet. So it's hard, isn't it? Because everyone thinks they're sticking to a gluten-free diet, but actually sometimes they're not. And I think that's why we need help. I think I know myself. You know, today I must have microdosed myself. My son was eating some crisps. I just nicked one from his packet. Popped it in my mouth, tasted great. And he said, "Did you know that's got barley?" And I thought, "No, I didn't." Oh no. And it's those sort of it's the thoughtlessness, you know. I was just doing it. I was just messing with him, and you just, what can I do? I just did it, you know. And so trying to eliminate those antibodies is really hard. And like I say, I think there's a great need for ongoing diet. I know I need it. There are times when I need it anyway.
Yeah, I think we can all identify with that struggle. I'm grouping around 15 questions here. A lot of questions about, so do the brain changes reverse when a gluten-free diet is followed, or is it permanent? And would reinitiating a gluten challenge for several weeks after going gluten-free be risky in terms of additional damage?
So the good news is that in terms of the gluten challenge, I don't think you should worry about it. The duration of the exposure is very short, and the sort of changes we're talking about take years to accumulate. So a short, brisk gluten challenge should be fine. In terms of reversibility, gosh, okay, so we've done this. I haven't presented the work here because of time, but we've done a lot of work using something called spectroscopy with MR imaging, which measures the brain's biochemistry. And that is a reflection of the enzymes and those sort of things that are working in the brain. And we've definitely demonstrated that they do improve on gluten-free diet. And that's part of what we do as part of our monitoring of patients with neurological disease and gluten sensitivity. Atrophy, once the brain is lost, it's lost, I'm afraid. But that doesn't matter, because largely what happens is you adapt. and you find new ways of doing things, or you maybe don't, we, as one ages, you find yourself doing things in slightly different ways anyway, and it's part of that process. So it's about not getting worse, isn't it? And like I said, the people who present with celiac disease are in many ways the fortunate part of this group, because they tend to be younger and they have symptoms that tend to make them present in the first place, and help motivate you to stay in a gluten-free diet. Whereas if it's neurological issues like balance, your balance isn't going to get massively worse because you've had an acute gluten exposure, or is unlikely to anyway. So it's harder. So I think if you stick to a gluten-free diet, what you're trying to do is not get any worse. Okay, that's got to be the goal.
And the Beyond Celiac Sheffield,
great.
Sorry, the current study, is it possible to still participate in it?
So at the moment, what we're doing is looking at the patients. We've got a lot of patients who we've followed up for a long time. So that's what we're doing. We're looking at the real world data. So we will be running some new studies soon, but at the moment, no, we're just following our patients. I think it's hard, isn't it? I mean, I think I should just stress, I have no financial interest in any of these companies that make any of these antibody tests whatsoever. But I do think at some point people need to get into the idea that it's a form of biofeedback, isn't it? If you have the antibody tests and you thought you're doing a good job, and it turns out the antibodies tell you you're not, then you need to look at things and try and work out where things aren't going right. And it gives you that opportunity. Whereas if you never get tested, you won't know. You'll be thinking I'm doing a good job and I'm fine, and not know. Because to be honest, one of the things is that sometimes the bowel is actually more forgiving than the brain. So maybe you can get to a level as a celiac patient and not have bowel symptoms, and still not actually get as low as you need to go to try and stop the neurological conditions. If you have neurological symptoms, you've got to remember, it's not all people with celiac disease that are going to get the neurological problems. It's only some people with it. And one of the markers for that seems to be this TG6. So there's quite a strong argument in my mind for rolling out TG6 to identify these people who, like me, I was TG6 positive, need to go on a gluten-free diet and be strict about it, and it's in their long-term brain health interest to do so.
Yeah, we'll watch for that test to become more widely available. In your case studies, did you find any differences in the brain conditions between those who are celiac and have been gluten-free for some time versus those who were more recently diagnosed, more recently consuming gluten?
Okay, so there's two things to say there. One is that the answer is, if you have only just recently been diagnosed with gluten sensitivity, if you're at the same age as somebody who's had gluten sensitivity diagnosed for a lot longer, then it may, that doesn't mean that you are going to be any different between the two. You probably won't notice the difference between the two. But like I say, the gluten-free diet is to arrest progression of change. Okay. And that's got to be the take-home message, that we're not trying to reverse things. You may get some improvement, and that's great if you do, but it's about not getting worse.
We had a lot of questions about associations, whether you've noticed any connection between celiac disease and autism, for example, Down syndrome.
So we have written a paper on that. The jury's out. I mean, I think. So maybe, I mean, there may be very slight, but it's. I mean, one wonders, with my neurodevelopment hat on, one wonders whether we're looking in the right place. Is it the person with the autism Was it that the antibodies got crossed the placenta and affected brain development? We don't know, do we? No, nobody's looked. Nobody knows. So I don't know. I think the what we like I say, we wrote a paper on it. The evidence isn't strong anyway, either way, and it's to some extent conflicting. So I'm not gonna commit to one side or the other of the argument. My mind's open on it.
Would it be similarly unclear with links to Parkinson's, multiple sclerosis, schizophrenia, even insomnia?
I think some patients, we do have some patients who have what looks like MS on scans, and they go on a gluten-free diet, and it arrests the progress of their condition, whatever it is. Whether that's because the inflammation from celiac disease helps drive the inflammation from MS, I don't know. Or whether it's genuinely that actually what looks like MS isn't MS at all, and it's somehow related to gluten. I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. Okay. But we do have a small group of patients like that.
Would it be correct to assume that non-celiac people, like we wouldn't expect them to show neurological damage that's caused by gluten?
No. Quite the reverse. So the majority of patients, not a big majority, but the majority of patients who we have in the neurology clinic with gluten-related neurology do not have and are never diagnosed with celiac disease. Okay, they have anti-gliadin antibodies. They may have low levels of anti-TG2, but what they do have often, if they have the ataxia, is they have the anti-TG6 antibody. But they don't necessarily, all they have are anti-gliadins, and what defines them as a group, really, more than anything, is that their neurology improves and is the progression of their condition by going on a gluten-free diet.
Thank you for clarifying there. I think this will be our last question, one that everyone will be wondering about. As an expert in brain health, can you suggest any nutrients, minerals, anything that could be taken as a supplementation to maximize health?
Well, okay. I'm not speaking as an expert here. I'm speaking as the same as you guys. I really believe that inflammation is bad for the brain. Okay, so what's the corollary of that? The corollary of that is that you should look after yourself in terms of diet, because one of the manifestations of inflammation is something called activated microglia, and these are immune cells that patrol the brain. They're about 10% of the brain by weight, and they can create lots of oxidation products, and that can potentially damage the brain. And actually, there is some evidence anyway that inflammation promotes anxiety and that it promotes depression. And I am a naturally anxious person, and I have to say, I went on a gluten-free diet and my anxiety improved. It doesn't go away. I've still got that trait. I've still got those enzyme changes that if you're an anxious person, you tend to have. But it was better. It was clearly better. So what I do is I try to eat as many antioxidants as I reasonably can, and I try to keep my microbiome in my gut as happy as can be. So you know, well, you know the things. So lots of different vegetables, lots of different fruit and veg and nuts and things like that, and not so much meat products, and obviously things like kefir or whatever your chosen, pickled kind of what's the word I'm after, but anyway, you know what I mean, live bacterial foods, cheeses and yogurts and stuff. So that's what I do. But yeah, I think inflammation is bad for the brain, and I think COVID taught us that all around the world, actually. that inflammation is bad for the brain.
Okay. Good advice for anyone. Well, thanks again, Dr. Hoggard, for joining us. I know it's after 9 in the evening where you are, so really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us.
Okay, no worries. Thank you.
Have a great evening.